All right. So, I'm so glad you guys could join us today. This is our very first episode of From the Collection, which we hope, we'll see, could turn into a regular series. We're very excited today because we're going to be sharing with you guys some objects from the collection here at the Chapman Museum. So before we begin, we're going to start with some introductions. My name is Becca, and I am the Program and Outreach Coordinator at the Chapman Museum. Basically, that means that I come up with the programs like this one that you guys get to attend, and I also get to teach people about history. Our curator, Maureen, is here. Maureen, do you want to tell everyone what your job is?
Sure. My job is to come up with exhibits for the museum and take care of the objects that the museum owns, like some of the things you see behind you.
Yeah. All right, and we have one more introduction to make, and his name is
Birds with a mouse here. I'm the mouse of the house.
Zopher. You scared me. You can't jump out like that.
Just here. It's my first time on camera.
All right. Well, Zopher, guys, everyone, Zopher is the official mascot of the Chapman Museum. And Zopher, you have a pretty interesting name.
I do?
Yeah, I think so. It's not a name we hear very often. Do you know where you got your name from?
Oh, my parents?
No, not your parents. All right, you were named after Zopher or Z.I. DeLong. Zopher DeLong was the original owner of the DeLong House, which is part of the Chapman Museum.
I remember.
Great. All right, so we have a lot to get through this afternoon. So to get started, Maureen, do you want to tell us a little bit about the collection here at the museum? And I'm going to share our screen, hopefully, so you guys can see it.
So the Chapman Museum has lots of objects that are from the past. We store these items in our archives and in our collection space, and many of these items are primary sources. So a primary source is an object that was used or created by someone in the past. Primary sources can be letters, photographs, artifacts, clothing, speeches, and more. The kids in this picture here on the slide are looking at primary sources that can be found in the dining room of the DeLong House here at the museum.
Those objects are from the 1800s. I guess you could say they're in their Victorian era.
Yes, Zopher. You know what? I didn't know you were a Swiftie.
Me? Oh, Taylor. She's not her cat.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine. All right. Well, today we are going to have a very special program. We're going to look at two different objects from the museum's collection. We're going to learn about what period in history those objects came from, what they were used for, and some other important information. Now, throughout the program, if you'd like, you are welcome to participate. I'm going to be asking questions. We have a small enough group, so if you want to just shout out, unmute yourself and answer verbally, feel free. Or if you would rather type it in the chat, you can do that too. So yeah, if you feel or want to kind of contribute, feel free. It's more fun if you do, but you can also just sit back and relax as well. So the first question I'm going to ask you today is, what do you know about the French and Indian War? And if you don't know that term, maybe what comes to mind when you hear the word French and Indian War? Let me see if I can open up our chat. Anybody want to share what they think they know about the French and Indian War? All right, it's okay if you don't, because that's where I come in. I'm going to give you some historical context. Historical context is kind of like background information. It helps us know what was going on in history at the time when this object would have been used. So, the French and Indian War is part of a larger conflict known as the 7 Years' War. It was fought between 1754 to 1763, and our two main combatants are Great Britain and France. They are fighting in what is now the United States and Canada, and the reason they're fighting is over land. Land is super important to Europeans in the 1700s. Everybody wants land. Now, both Great Britain and France had allies or people who would help them fight in the war or win battles. A lot of the times, these allies were Native Americans who were living in the region at this time. They also had help from colonists who were living in North America at this time. A colonist is someone who comes from another country and they settle in a new country and they live there usually permanently. The Europeans who lived in these colonies called themselves colonists, and for the most part, the ones we're going to focus on, they considered themselves British. So they did not consider themselves Americans yet, they considered themselves British. Right? All right, so I always like to begin with a map because I think that helps us kind of give a sense of what the country looked like at that time. So you'll notice on our map, we have the French territory in this nice yellow color, and the British territory is in purple. And you will notice that right along the coast is a whole bunch of purple colonies. Anybody think they know how many colonies might have been on the coast at this time? Anyone want to give a guess? Anyone want to give a guess? All right, Zopher, go ahead. You are correct. There would have been 13. Very good. There would have been 13 British colonies. We in America know them as the 13 original colonies. All right, so our next picture I'm going to show you, you might not have seen these guys before, but I want you to take a moment, kind of look at them, get a sense of how they're dressed, what they look like, and maybe if you feel up to it, sharing what you notice about them. Anyone want to share what they notice? All right. Well, these two men are kings of England. At this point in history, America is ruled by a king. America is a colony, or at least New York is a colony of Great Britain, and the King of England is someone who rules over those colonies. Now, we have two kings because there were two different kings during the French and Indian War. This guy on the left, this is King George II. And the guy on the right is King George III. And you've probably heard that name before because of the American Revolution. So King George II was King of England during most of the French and Indian War. He dies in 1760, and then his son, King George III, takes over and he finishes out the war as the ruler of England. All right. Now, I also want to share with you some images that show you what everyday life looked like, because it really helps us get a picture of what the past kind of looked like. So our first image is of what a woman would have traditionally worn during the French and Indian War. This is a picture of a modern day woman, but she's dressed as if it were the 1700s. So women during this time, they would have worn long skirts or dresses, as you can see. They would have covered their hair with a cap, which kept it clean and kept it out of their face while they were working. And they probably would have had an apron over their dress, which would have helped keep it clean. Now, if you were a man and you were serving in the army during the French and Indian War, you probably would have worn a very brightly colored uniform. Now, for the British, they tend to wear bright red coats, and you've probably heard that before too. Red coats, American Revolution, their uniforms don't change in that span of time. So the British would wear bright red coats, like I said. The French usually wore white or blue. All right, so this is my favorite picture I get to share. You most likely know who this is, but you might not have seen this picture before. Does anyone want to give a guess as to who this might be? All right, well, this is a picture of a very young George Washington. George Washington is about 21 years old in this painting, and at that age, he was actually serving in the British Army, because remember, America doesn't exist yet. We're a colony of Great Britain. So he's serving in the British Army as a lieutenant colonel. That's someone who's kind of high up there. But unfortunately, he's not doing a very good job. Oh my God, Zopher! All right. All right. It's true. George Washington wasn't always the great leader we think of him as today. In fact, during the French and Indian War, he actually had to surrender a fort to the French when they overpowered it.
Surrender means to give up.
That's right, Zopher. So George Washington has to give up his fort to the French. Now, I mentioned that both the French and the British have allies. Those are people who can help them win or fight in the war. And many times those allies were Native Americans. So in this drawing, you're going to notice that the Native Americans are dressed very differently than the Europeans are. Native Americans at this time wore animal skins or fur, and they had very different fighting tactics as well. And finally, I want to share with you a painting of what a battle between the French and the British might have looked like. So you'll notice down here that the British are wearing their red coats. Their flag is waving up above them. On the other side in white, we have the French. And you're also going to notice that the weapons they're using are very different from the weapons soldiers would use today. All right. Now, as I mentioned, the French and Indian War was fought almost over 200 years ago, and daily life looked very different than it is today. So I wanted to show you some pictures of what that looked like as well. So our first picture is what a typical house or maybe a kitchen would have looked like in the mid 1700s. There is no electricity, so you would probably have a big fireplace in your home that you would use to cook your food and to heat your house. There are no cars, so if you wanted to get someplace that wasn't in walking distance, you're going to have to use a wagon or a carriage. So you would hook up your wagon or your carriage to a team of horses, and then you would have to drive the horses, and the horses would lead the wagon. There's no email, there's no texting. So if you want to communicate with someone and they're in a different part of the country, you have to write them a letter. To do this, you would have used a quill and ink. So a quill is a feather that comes from a large bird, usually an eagle or a turkey. You would dip your quill in ink, and then you would handwrite your letter, and then you would mail it. And depending on how far away you're mailing this letter, it might get there in a couple days, or it might get there in a couple months. Mail service is pretty slow during the early 1700s, and if you wanted to send a letter to England, it's going to take you several months. And then finally, as I mentioned before, there's no electricity. So you can't switch on the lights like you would nowadays. So instead, you would use candles to light your house. And many colonists made their own candles.
So no Alexa, turn off the lights?
Nope, nope. More like something like, someone please light a candle before I trip over the cat in the dark. Oh, sorry, Zopher. There's no cat. Okay, never mind. And Maureen, would you mind putting on a pair of gloves and showing off our first object?
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to scoot out of the way.
A lot of the time, curators and museum staff will wear gloves when they're handling historic objects. And this just protects the objects from any oil and dirt that might be on our hands. But it's always best if you wash and dry your hands beforehand. Okay, so I'm going to pick up the object and I'll hold it in front of the camera for you, give you some multiple angles to view it.
And as Maureen is holding up that object, start thinking about what you notice. Maybe its size, its shape, color, materials might have been used in it. She's going to give you a pretty good look at everything. And you can type in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and share your observations, you can. Right now, we're just focused on what it looks like, what we can tell just by looking at it.
There we go.
All right. Yeah, you can keep it there for now. All right, so now that you've had a good look. Uh-oh, Tyler says bullhorn. Sounds interesting. So now that you've had a good look at it, take some time to think about what it might have been used for or what it is. So Tyler gave us the guess of a bullhorn. Might be something it is. Anybody else have guesses about what this object could be or what it could be used for? All right, Zopher, do you want to give us a drum roll? All right, go for it. Very nice. Maureen, what is this object?
This is a powder horn.
All right. So I'm going to share our screen for a little bit and we're going to get some more info on what a powder horn is.
So a powder horn was used to keep gunpowder dry and in a safe place. A horn would come from a cow or an oxen. So Tyler, I guess you weren't too far off.
Good job.
It's from a cow or an oxen, which many colonists would have had on their farms already. So there were two ends to the horn. You'll notice a smaller end and then a larger end. And the gunpowder would be stored inside the horn. Each end usually had a stopper or a cap to prevent the gunpowder from falling out. You can see the cap here on the bottom. And then there's a small cap here on the top. These caps were sometimes made of brass or copper, and a strap would be tied around the powder horn, and a soldier could sling it over their shoulder to carry it. During the French and Indian War, soldiers used muskets, which are a type of gun. And to fire a musket, a soldier needed to pour a small amount of gunpowder from the powder horn into the musket. So they would use the smaller end of the horn to pour. You can notice there is some damage to the very end of this powder horn.
Just like in the picture down there, you can see that he's using the smaller end to tap a little bit of gunpowder into his musket.
Exactly. It was also very common for soldiers to engrave their powder horns. They carved their names, initials, dates of battles that they fought in, maps, or lists of places that they might have traveled. Small pictures, sayings, or phrases could have also been carved into the powder horn. Since the powder horn would go with them just about everywhere, it was almost like a diary that soldiers could use to record what was happening in their lives by engraving right here on the powder horn. So now on our powder horn, you'll see, I know it's tough to see on the screen, but you'll see there are engravings on the cap, and it has the initials JGM and the year 1758.
And we have big pictures on the screen for you to look at.
Perfect.
Yep.
And the word north.
So, horn.
Well, Zopher, we don't actually know who owned the powder horn.
Oh, you're Maureen.
Well, that's not true, Zopher. And there are many times when historians don't know everything about an object, a person, or an event. They piece together clues to try and form a picture or a story, and that's what we'll have to do here. We'll use these engravings to help give us just a little bit more information.
So what did the engravings tell us about who might have owned this powder horn?
Well, we might not know the soldier's exact name, but we can assume that his initials were J, G, and M.
Makes sense.
And he probably used this powder horn in 1758, which was during the time period of the French and Indian War.
And we also know that there was a battle fought not too far away from here that took place in 1758.
There was?
There was. All right. So in July of 1758, there was a battle called the Battle of Carillon, and it was fought about an hour north of Glens Falls at what is now called Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga is located where Lake George meets Lake Champlain. This is really important in warfare because whoever got to occupy that fort got to control two major waterways. Waterways are really important in war because it allows soldiers or armies to transport supplies, troops, materials, whatever they need to win battles. They can transport up those waterways to the soldiers waiting for them in the fort. And this fort was so important because it was able to give them both Lake Champlain and Lake George. So the British, they know this, and they want to take the fort from the French. So they plan to attack it.
Ooh, how are they gonna do that?
Well, what they do is they take 16,000 men, they row them north up Lake George towards Fort Ticonderoga, and they fight a battle there against the French. Unfortunately, though, they lose. Yeah, funny. All right, so our next object actually comes from the Civil War, and I think a lot of people kind of already have some info on the Civil War. And I want you guys to share, what do you already know about the Civil War? Or if you don't know anything about the Civil War, what comes to mind when you hear that term? So if anyone wants to share, feel free. If not, I will go in to give you some historical context, just like last time. Zopher, you know anything about the Civil War?
It was between the North and the South.
Whoa, Zopher, you're one smart mouse. You might have a history teacher in your family.
Maybe.
Maybe. All right. Or the cheese. Maybe the cheese helped you. All right. So the Civil War, so for you, all right. I am going to stop and just pause for a second. I'm going to start off with a definition. So when we hear the word or the term Civil War, that is kind of a blanket term. It doesn't just apply to the United States. A civil war is a war that is fought between two groups of people who live in the same country. Now, in the United States, when we talk about the Civil War, we are referring to the American Civil War, which was fought between 1861 and 1865. Now, Zopher, like you said, it is fought between two sides. One of those sides is the Union, sometimes known as the Northern States, and the other side is the Confederacy, sometimes known as the Southern States. In the year before the Civil War, the many southern states had seceded or left the United States to form their own country, which they called the Confederate States of America. And they left because they wanted to continue the practice of slavery. Now, when we say left, we don't mean that they packed up their bags and moved to a new place. It means that they no longer wanted to be part of the United States and they wanted to form their own country. However, this isn't allowed. Once you are a state and you are part of the United States, you don't get to decide, oh, we're going to form our own country. New York doesn't get to say, you know what? We're going to be our own country. We're going to be the country of New York. Doesn't work that way. You got to stay in the Union. So just like before, I'm going to show you a map of the country. So you will notice that our northern states are in blue. This is also known as the Union. And our southern states or our Confederate states are in red. And you'll also notice that they are separated from the rest of the country. These are the states that seceded from the Union. Zopher, you notice anything?
You must have needed a really big saw to cut it in half.
No, they didn't use a saw. The Confederate States are still physically connected to the rest of the country. They just chose to stop following the rules and laws of the United States and they formed their own. Now, anyone know who the president of the United States was during the Civil War? Oh, I see some nodding. All right. For those of you who don't know, the President of the United States during the Civil War was Mr. Abraham Lincoln himself. He is one of our most famous presidents, and he's one of our most beloved as well. His picture is on our money. He's on the penny. He's on the $5 bill. His face or his depiction is on Mount Rushmore. And there's even a memorial dedicated to him in Washington, D.C. So just like before, I want to share some images of everyday life. So again, women are wearing very long skirts or dresses. Now, they do have something different in the 1860s. Sometimes they wore an undergarment called hoops, and this would allow their skirts to kind of billow out in front of them, and you can see that in the picture. Now, men who served in the military or in the armies during the Civil War would have worn uniforms just like the British before. It's hard to tell in these black and white photos, but men who served in the Union Army, which is the guy up top, typically wore blue uniforms. That wasn't always the case, but typically. And men who served in the Confederate Army typically wore gray uniforms. Again, not always, but was usually the case. And you'll also notice that we have photographs of these people. Now, during the French and Indian War, we only had drawings or paintings or pictures. Now we have actual photographs of people. And that's because photography becomes really accessible during the Civil War, and we're finally able to get pictures of what people looked like. And we also have to talk about a very serious issue or topic in American history, and that is slavery. So someone who is enslaved must work for another person without pay. Enslaved people worked long hours without breaks, and they were bought and sold like objects. In the South, African Americans were enslaved, and they were used as labor on large farms called plantations. They would pick cotton, sometimes rice, or sometimes even tobacco on these farms, and then the owners of these farms would sell those crops for money. The southern states that broke away from the Union wanted to keep the practice of slavery because it allowed them to have a cheap labor source. So slavery is something that is a huge part of the Civil War, so it's definitely something we have to acknowledge before going any further. But I do want to show you what some images of everyday life looked like. So this is a parlor or a living room, a typical parlor or living room from the 1860s. Again, there's no electricity in most homes, so fireplaces or small stoves would have heated the room. And since those houses did not have electricity, they would have lit the room using kerosene lamps. People still used carriages to travel long distances. Again, they would hook them up to horses and the horses would lead them on. However, communication does improve. There is now some change. You don't have to just write a letter to someone. You're sometimes able to send a telegram. And the picture I just sent up to the screen is a telegraph. And a telegraph would allow a person to send a message to another person in the country. And what they would do is a telegraph operator would turn someone's message into a series of dots and dashes called Morse code. They would send that message over a line, and an operator on the other end of the line would then transcribe that message into English so the person on the other end of the line could read it.
Let's use something similar to that.
You do?
It's called Morse code.
All right. Well, moving on. This is a picture of an outhouse. Anybody know what an outhouse might be? Oh, I see some nodding. Fantastic. All right. So an outhouse, sometimes called a privy, is an outdoor bathroom. It's kind of like a porta potty would be today. Most homes during the Civil War did not have indoor plumbing. So when you had to do your business, you would do it outside. So you're a mouse. You do your business outside all the time.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, we are going to stop sharing our screen because it is time for our next object. Maureen's going to come into the picture. She's putting on her gloves again to keep that object safe. And she's going to show it off. And just like before, I want you guys to start thinking about what you see, what you notice. Now, our object is a little clunky, so we're doing our best to show you. But get some ideas about what it might have been made out of, what it looks like. Ooh, she's showing some tools that were found inside. Think about size, shape, and color.
And it's in this nice box.
Ooh, it's in a box. All right, and now they've had a good look, start thinking about what it might have been used for or what it is. That object right there might give you some hints. All right. Anyone want to share what they think it might be? Gloria does not know. Neither does Nicole. All right, Zopher, you ready for a drum roll? Very good, Zopher. Maureen, this object is...
This is a surgical kit.
Fantastic. I'm going to share our screen again so we can see it, and we'll give you some info on this surgical kit.
So this surgical kit would have been used by a doctor during the Civil War. So during the war, many soldiers were wounded or injured, and when that happened, a doctor would use their surgical kit to perform surgeries or procedures on wounded soldiers. Sometimes doctors had to perform amputations. They had to remove a soldier's arm or leg if the wound was too bad, and they used the tools in their surgical kit to do this.
It's okay, Zopher. Sometimes history is a little gory. Now, we are not going to show pictures of amputations, and we are not going to go into specifics about how a doctor might have done that procedure. However, if this is something you don't want to listen to, it's okay, Zopher. You can turn down your volume for a little bit, and I will give you a thumbs up when the coast is clear. But if you'd like to stay on. We're just going to talk about some of the tools inside this kit. All right, so
the first thing I'm going to pull out is our bone saw.
Whoa.
So this is what you see right away when you look in that surgical kit. And as the name suggests, a bone saw would have been used to cut through bone. And as you can see, it's got some pretty big teeth on it to get that job accomplished.
Zopher, you seeing it?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, big teeth. Gotta cut through bone. I know, they are. How about that object that looks like a strap that we saw before? What would that be used for?
So that object, let me find it.
Did you have a guess? What do you think? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Maureen. Object that looks like a strap.
No, and there was the strap to the cape. You could use it to help carry the cape's just the horn.
That's a good guess, Zopher, but this is on the inside of the case, and this unravels here, and it would have been used as a tourniquet.
Oh.
So it's hard to see here, but you've got a clamp that's part of it, and then this canvas cord would wrap around. And so tourniquets were used to cut off the flow of blood to a limb, and you would wrap the strap around the arm or leg and pull it tight, and then tighten it even more. Ooh. And using this screw at the very top to tighten it. And tourniquets are actually still used in surgeries today. And it makes it so that it's safer for the patient when they're getting that limb amputated.
Right. All right. How about the actual wound? How would a doctor remove a bullet from a wound?
So a doctor might use an object like forceps.
Okay.
Grab these here. Forceps are kind of like scissors, but instead of cutting, they kind of clamp onto an object. Now, the doctor could open the forceps, grab onto the bullet. I know it's hard to see with everything in the back. Grab onto the bullet and pull it out of the soldier's wound. These forceps are called bone forceps, and they could be used for removing fragments of bone from a soldier's wound.
Did it hurt?
Yes. So a wounded soldier would probably have been in some pain. However, most battlefield surgeries during the Civil War are done with anesthesia. And if you don't know, anesthesia is a medicine that's given to someone to help them fall asleep during surgery. All right, so I'm giving you the thumbs up if you turned off your volume. Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about the man who owned this kit.
Yes, so this kit was owned by Dr. Buell Streeter. And I think it's got his name on it.
It does, yep.
Right here on the front, if you can see it.
There.
That plaque says his name there.
Pretty cool.
So he moved to Glens Falls after the Civil War. And this is a picture of what he looked like on the screen. And below is a picture of Dr. Streeter on his horse, Prince. So the kit was owned and used by Dr. Buell, like we said. During the Civil War, Dr. Streeter served as a surgeon with the Union Army. He helped soldiers at major battles such as Bull Run and Gettysburg. In 1864, Dr. Streeter was taken prisoner by the Confederacy, but he was released 6 days later. Dr. Streeter was an excellent surgeon, and he was able to save the limbs of many men who had been shot.
Wow, Dr. Streeter was quite the doctor.
He was, Zopher, and it's really cool that we have the actual kit that he used in our collection here at the museum. We do want to share one last thing with you, and that is to say it is your turn. So we want you to get creative. Now that you have learned some things about the objects that the Chapman has in their collection, we want you to create a piece of art. This can be a drawing, this can be a story, a poem, a song, something we didn't think of, but we wanted to incorporate one of the objects we discussed today. So you can send your artwork with your first name to my email address, which is educator@chapmanmuseum.org. And if you do that, you might be featured on our social media pages, which is pretty cool. All right. Well, goodbye, Zopher, and thanks again for joining us. And to all of you who joined us today, thank you so much. We're going to have another episode of From the Collection on Thursday, August 15th at 2 p.m. It'll be on Zoom. So if you liked what you see today, we hope you come back. Zopher is certainly going to come back, it looks like. And as always, please visit the museum. We've got tons of cool stuff. So thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.